How do you write a great personal statement? In this video I'm going to show you the tips and tricks that the top private schools use to help their students write amazing personal statements for university entrance exams. I worked in those schools for 7 years and prepared students for the very top universities across the UK and abroad. I'm going to share with you the secrets and the structures of the personal statements that those students write and the ways in which these schools prepare students to write amazing personal statements. Because really, whether you're a student at a private school, at a state school, whatever your family background, everyone deserves the chance to have their applications seen equally by these universities, and so I really hope that by putting this advice out there, it can be helpful to a really broad range of people. If you found the content on this channel useful in the past, or you find this video useful, please do consider supporting me over at Patreon. I'll put the link in the description below, or you can also go over to the Mathsaurus website and take a look at the books and wider reading that I've suggested there. I've put that there because they're all things that I really genuinely recommend, and perhaps some of those things will be interesting ideas for books to read to mention on your personal statement. And there's also a whole section on books that are specifically aimed at preparing for university mathematics as well, so I hope that's useful. So I'm going to be talking about a few different things in this video, and I'll put some timestamps below to different ideas if you want to skip ahead to them. But I'm going to certainly talk about the structure of the personal statement, what I think the right proportions are for talking about different things. I'm going to give you a 3-step sort of strategy to write any statement within your personal statement that I think you should apply over and over again to everything that you're saying. I'm going to talk about some common mistakes that people make in the personal statements and some things to avoid, the things to put in an introduction and not to put in and the things definitely not to put in an introduction, and also give some overall tips and guidance on the process and answer some common questions as well. Now, I'm talking here about an application to university in general, and I think most of what I'm going to say could be applicable to quite a wide range of subjects, but this is a maths channel, and so I'm assuming really as well that a lot of people here are applying for maths or science subjects or something similar. So probably what I'm saying is most applicable to those sorts of subjects, but the structure certainly is one that I've advised for students in my tutor groups at school that are doing other subjects as well. But you might want to adapt it slightly differently, especially in subjects where you're also trying to demonstrate a little bit of writing skill as well. Sometimes the sort of style of the writing might be different. Okay, so what about the structure of the statement? Now, my advice is this. Start with a short 1-paragraph introduction, probably just a few lines about the basics of your application, what you're applying for, why you're applying for it. I'll talk a bit more about good and bad introductions in a second, but there'll be some sort of introductory statement there. Then the main bulk of the application should actually be a paragraph for each of your A-level subjects. I'm assuming here you're doing 3 or 4 A-levels, and how they have prepared you for the course that you're applying to, and what you've got from them, and how well you've done in them. Okay, and then at the end there'll be some sort of paragraph at the end, probably a bit longer than the introductory paragraph, because that's also going to include some of your extracurricular activities, some additional things there as well. Depending how much extra stuff you've done and how much of it is relevant to your application, I might put a bit more there, but bear in mind that you're applying for an academic course, and the tutors are mostly going to be interested in how you're going to get on in that course. Yes, you want to include extracurricular things, but mostly to the extent that they support your application. So extracurriculars, especially when we're thinking about Oxbridge, but also other places, mostly those extracurriculars are about proving something about your time management, or maybe working in teams if that's relevant to a course where you're having to do project work, or if there's a placement year or something like that, that you're showing that you there will be someone who'll be quite suitable to do that sort of stuff. But it's not really for the extracurriculars in themselves, right? So most UK universities, at least, are not recruiting on that basis at all. Now, if you're applying to US universities, there's a very different game in play over there. So do think about that slightly differently. But say UK universities, in particular Oxbridge, really, you can almost take or leave some of those extracurricular activities. Now, a lot of people really resist when I say that so much of their application should be about their A-level studies, because they're so keen to put in their wider reading, to demonstrate some extra things that they've done, and they say, but my A-levels are already in my application, I don't need to include them because they can see what I've done. And I really disagree with that statement, because your A-levels are your main preparation for the course that you're going to do. Yes, you've done all this wider reading, and those things might differentiate you from other people, and they should definitely be included in the personal statement. In fact, you might put some wider reading in each of your A-level paragraphs, but fundamentally you're applying to do more of the same thing that you're currently doing because you've done well at it, because you're enjoying it, and because you want to carry on with it. And really, that's the main point of a good professional application. And this ties into one of the common misconceptions that people have, that especially for Oxford and Cambridge, you have to somehow demonstrate that you're some kind of super genius, and that they really like offbeat characters, and that they want someone who's going to rip apart the rules and, write something absolutely brilliant. So the reality of it is just that's not true. Okay, firstly, there just aren't that many super geniuses in the world, and there's a lot more places, even at Oxford and Cambridge, than there are people that fit into exactly that mould. But you're really trying for these applications to show that you're someone that they want to teach. And believe it or not, although these academics are very exceptional people and are sometimes slightly wacky characters, most of the time they actually do quite like working with students who are organised, who are going to hand in their work, who are going to be professional and take a professional attitude towards their studies. So yes, there is sometimes a brilliance in sort of wacky characters and things, but actually even the people that I know that might at least sort of outwardly fit that bill also have this incredible work ethic, have a really professional attitude to their studies. And so you can put in a bit of character into your personal statement for sure, and getting your personality across in places is important, but let's not take that to the extreme. You're still, mathematics is a logical subject. We value rigor, we value discipline, academically at least, so I think you should bear that in mind. So I should say, when I'm talking about including your A-level subjects in the personal statement, I'm not talking about simply just listing what A-levels you do and what grades you've got. That stuff they can see in your application form. But highlighting where you've done particularly well on a subject and what you think that shows about your application is relevant. And picking a bit of something that you've done in that A-level subject, just like you would be talking about your wider reading, is clearly very relevant and useful, right? So nobody ever everyone seems to be so keen to take a book that they've read, to sort of demonstrate that they've read a book, and to pick some interesting feature of it and say, but look, there was a really interesting example in that book. But your courses you're studying are also full of these really interesting examples. So showing that you can find something in those courses that's relevant for your studies, to me, is just a bit of a no-brainer, that's the sort of thing you'd think about including. Yes, you're trying to show that you've done it really well, that you've gone beyond the course a bit, but at a basic level, you're really trying to show that you've done these courses well, and that you're ready for the course you're about to apply for. Okay, and the other key thing that I want to say about everything you write in your personal statement, I would suggest it has these three parts. Firstly, say the thing that you're trying to say. Secondly, give some evidence for that statement. And thirdly, relate it to the course that you're applying to. And in particular, that third part is the bit that most students miss, and I very rarely see in any first draft of an application. Okay, so here's an example of this. Very often people talk about their maths challenges that they've done, and their maths challenge scores, and what they'll do is they'll simply say, I've got a gold certificate this year, a silver certificate this year, or I got through to the IMO or something, and then they'll just move on to the next thing, as if they're asking the tutor to fill in the gaps about what that means, right? Now, of course, that's an impressive thing in itself, and yes, the tutors do know why IMO candidates and gold certificate winners are good at math degrees. But what you're also partly trying to do is to show them that you know that as well. So you need to go a bit further, right? The gold certificate in the maths challenge is actually the second step of my 3-point plan, right? It's the evidence of something. So firstly, think about what it is that you're trying to evidence there. Are you trying to show that you're a great problem solver? Are you trying to show that you're enthusiastic about maths? Are you trying to show that you're good at a certain type of mathematical problem? So say that thing. So, I'm really enthusiastic about doing as much maths as I can, and I'm very good at maths, and then your evidence is that you've done all of these maths challenges. And the third thing is actually to say why that's useful for the course that you're applying to. Now, in the maths challenges, that might seem reasonably obvious, but particularly applying for a maths degree, there's a very different style of mathematics at university to A-level, and this can be a good opportunity to show that you've done some research about that, and to show that you know what you're signing up for. So are the maths challenges more like university level maths than A-level maths is? And the answer is they are in some ways and in some ways not. If you want some more recommendations for things that I think are great preparation for university maths degrees and things to put on the personal statement, head over to the Mathsaurus website, and I've collected there some of my favourite books, including some that have been specifically written for Oxbridge preparation and for university maths preparation. I've got a couple of those books right here, both written by Oxford tutors. This one is Why Study Mathematics by Vicky Neal, who teaches some of the first year courses at Oxford, I think, at the moment, and is a mathematician there. And this is a slightly more informal book where, it's very, very readable. As you can, if I just flick to a random page, you can see it's mostly words rather than numbers, although there is a little bit of maths in there as well. But it's mostly about this idea of like, why would you study for a maths degree? What you're going to get out of it? What sort of people are successful in it? And that's a bit of the personal statement that's so often missing. It really is meant to be a personal statement, right? So it's meant to be a statement about you. So you should be talking about these things. You should be talking about like what this means for you and your life as much as the maths in itself. The other one here, Richard Earle's book that I've suggested and recommended before, Towards Higher Mathematics. This is very much a maths textbook. If I go to a random page of this one, you'll see a lot of exercises and mathematical formulae and things. And this is an excellent book written in the language of A-level mathematics that can help you transition from A-level to university maths. Loads more suggestions over at the website as well, so do go and take a look at those too. So let's talk about that introductory paragraph. And again, it's one that people agonize over so much. Everyone's trying to find the perfect quote or to capture the audience in some amazing statement at the very beginning. And my advice is, firstly, don't worry about this too much when you start writing the statement. It's much better just to get a bulk of a good statement done. So my advice is always write it badly first and then edit it and write it again. That might mean just missing out the first paragraph to begin with, because it can be a real block for people. But actually also, I would say don't do any of those things. So don't open with some majestic quote. Definitely don't open by saying something like, from the age of 3, I knew that I was born to be a mathematician. I mean, that's just an obviously false statement, right? So yes, you can talk about a pivotal moment, perhaps. You might say, I realised that maths was more than just a passion for me, that I wanted to study it at university at a moment where I saw this proof, or when I got my GCSE results, or at some other moment. That's fine. But if you're going to say something like that, try to avoid that sort of ridiculous hyperbolic sort of statement that doesn't really impress anyone. And I've read so many of these statements, and you just read the same things over and over again. So try and avoid that. Again, like well-chosen quotes tend not to be particularly useful. I mean, it's someone else's words. Yes, you've selected them, but what does that really say about you? So my advice is actually just to open with the main thing you're trying to say, which is that, something along the lines of, I really want to do a maths degree, right? Or perhaps it's that I really want to be an actuary. I think that's how I started my personal statement, actually. I said I really want to be an actuary, and so that's why I want to do a maths degree. Now, I mean, an actuary, if you don't know, by the way, is a sort of type of mathematician who does a lot of probability and statistics applied to insurance and pensions, and modelling how much money people have to put into their pensions to get the right payouts and all that sort of stuff. So that's a reasonable statement, right? Your personal statement is a personal statement, right? It's a statement about you, right? So it's not about the subject. And I suppose that brings me on to the second really common mistake that people make in personal statements, is that they write too much about maths, or they write too much about whatever subject it is that they're applying for. It's good to get across the idea that you have thought about the subject, that you know about it, that you've done some wider reading, but think about what just like repeating an explanation about an area of maths does for you. And if you think about it, it does very little. It's very easy to find explanations of mathematical subjects, to copy and paste them, even to reword them a bit. So you're really not trying to demonstrate that you understand some incredible bit of maths, right? That you've gone beyond the course and, trying to sort of give an explanation. Actually, usually when students try to give an explanation like that, they end up giving a pretty bad one, because they're trying to give a very difficult explanation in a very short space. And it comes across really badly then to maths tutors who do understand it very well. And even if you write it correctly, it's just not what's meant to be in the personal statement. So you're much better off saying I've read this book, and explaining something about what you've got from reading that book perhaps, but fitting it in with that 3-point statement. So really think about whether like the books that you're reading are evidence of something that's useful for the course, right? So often with wider reading, people are just, well, honestly, with wider reading, so often people are just trying to tick a box on their personal statement that they've done some wider reading. But trust me, no tutor has that as a box that they're trying to tick. The box is for enthusiasm, for some level of insight and understanding, and you can really tell the difference between people that have weaved together like a little bit of wider reading into a stronger narrative in the personal statement about themselves and about the course they're applying to, as opposed to people who've just said, I've read Fermat's Last Theorem. By the way, although I recommend that book highly, Simon Singh's Fermat's Last Theorem, it is mentioned on some enormous number of personal statements. So you might want to think about finding something a little bit more novel if you are going to include it, or just accept that you've read it for pleasure and it's not on your personal statement. So you might even just say, I've done a lot of wider reading, right? And actually the fact that I've done a lot of wider reading is evidence of my enthusiasm for the subject. You could list a few books without saying too much about them, and I mean, that's just as good, right? As long as it then sort of links in to saying, okay, well, why is someone who does wider reading going to be good at a math degree? One other thing people often get wrong in these statements is that they target their statements too much towards one university or too much towards one particular subject. So in particular, when people apply to Oxford and Cambridge, they often really focus on that to the detriment of everything else. I've even seen people who've actually written, about Oxford or Cambridge in their main personal statement. And okay, I understand that might be your first choice university, but just think about how that comes across to the other universities that are reading your application, right? And you want that personal statement to be well written for all of those universities. Oxford and Cambridge, in fact, might even look at your application and think that somehow this demonstrates some flaw, actually, because you haven't noticed that point. Similarly, if you're applying for different subjects at different universities, it's very, very hard to write a good personal statement. And so my advice is this: don't apply to 2 different subjects at different universities. Okay, you can get away with applying for maths somewhere and maths and computer science somewhere else, or history somewhere and history and politics somewhere else, or something like that, right? But if you're applying for history at one university and maths at another university, you're never going to be able to write a good personal statement for either. You're ultimately going to end up writing a bad one for both. And all it really shows is that you haven't decided what you want to do at university yet. And it's fine to have not decided. It might be that you need to take a gap year to decide. But really, for your application, you've got to choose one or the other. You've got to pick it and write your application all around that. And if you change your mind at a later date, there are ways of doing that through clearing or through taking a gap year or something. But really, you're making an application now. You have to make your mind up. Now, I've said you shouldn't apply for more than one subject, and you really shouldn't, but what if you're applying for 2 subjects that are quite similar, like maths and computer science, or maybe you're just applying for maths and economics at one university and maths everywhere else? This is very hard, and it's quite close to being different subjects, right? Because, fundamentally, if you start talking about economics in a pure maths application, it's going to sound a little bit strange, and you're not going to be able to write as directly about all of the courses. So what you really need to do there is to find the common theme. So if you're applying for maths with economics, I think it's pretty fair to assume that the university won't mind that you might be applying for a pure maths degree somewhere else. And so it would be okay for your application to focus just on mathematics. Yes, it might not be quite a strong application for maths and economics, but overall, that's just the best you're going to be able to do. So you can still perhaps talk about studying economics at A-level if you've done that, but weave it into a maths application. But so fundamentally, my advice there is that there is no perfect solution to that. Your application for that subject will be slightly weaker in one of those subjects. Focus on the core subjects, focus on the main things that you're applying for, and don't apply to a different course at every university, even if it is maths with something, right? If you're applying for maths and statistics, maths and economics, maths and philosophy, all these different subjects at different places, it is going to be harder to write that application for. When I applied to university, actually, although I ended up doing a pure maths degree at Oxford, I had applied for mathematics and statistics, and I'd applied for that at other universities as well. And for example, at Warwick, I applied for the Morse course, which also had operational research and economics as well as maths and statistics. And so it wasn't too hard to just ignore the operational research and economics parts for that application, they expect that on that particular course. That's quite a unique course, and students aren't going to be applying for that everywhere. And equally, actually, Oxbridge will be aware that they don't offer that course, and so if people are applying for that elsewhere, that's quite reasonable. But they would be a bit worried if you were applying for maths at one place and history at another place, I think. So one thing I get asked a lot is, does the personal statement even matter for a maths application? Especially when people are applying to Oxford, they say, oh, hang on, but I'm going to do the maths admissions test, or I'm going to do Tamur, or I'm going to do something else, and they're going to see that, and they're just going to basically make a decision based on that grade, right? And the personal statement then doesn't matter. And there is some evidence for that statement being true, and it depends a lot about who's reading your application and who's making the decisions. I certainly know at least one of the college tutors at the Oxford College I was at tended to say that was true, and that score would override more or less everything else, and I think it is a really important determining characteristic. On the other hand, that's not going to be true of all tutors, and this application is also going to be read by other universities. Sometimes at other universities it's going to be read by non-specialists as well, who might be going through something more of a tick box exercise or filtering the applications before they get to the ultimate decision makers. So I would be very wary of not taking the personal statement seriously. It probably does mean that in math, perhaps you might not spend as much time on the personal statement as if you're applying for other subjects. But on the other hand, I think this is a really important application you're making, and even if the impact of it is relatively minor, why would you not put some effort into that? And it's an opportunity to demonstrate something positively. It may be that it's not something they care about enormously, but I think it is an opportunity to do something positive, and so you should take that opportunity as much as you can. Another thing I'd really suggest you avoid is writing too informally. Sometimes people write these personal statements in a slightly informal, even a quite jokey kind of way. And whilst it's not necessarily the case that you should avoid any kind of humour or anything like that at all, it is a very risky strategy. I mean, things written humorously on paper, even if they could be spoken very well, can tend to come across as sort of sarcastic or arrogant, can just not quite leave the right impression. And if you think about this personal statement as a job application, which is sort of what it is, you would try and write it in a similar way. So it's a formal application to a university. Yes, you're trying to get across character, but you are trying to show to the tutors that you're going to be a professional student, if you like. So I'm not saying that it's a job exactly, but that you're going to engage in your studies professionally, you're going to take the course seriously, and that you care about what you're applying for. And overall, that just comes across so much better than something where you're trying to write in a conversational tone, or to try and do something more informally. So I would really strongly advise that. Also, this one sounds a bit strange to say, but avoid saying things that are negative, right? So don't say things that are bad about yourself, about the university, about the course, or any of those things. Now, very rarely do people directly say something bad about themselves, like, I'm really bad at maths, but sometimes they do put statements in like, despite the fact that I did badly in this, or despite the fact that it's not quite the perfect course for me, I think it's the best out of all the ones that I've got available. And that's an example of being just a little bit too honest in an application, perhaps, right? Now, there are sometimes reasons why you might talk about times where you haven't done as well as you might have done. If, for example, you've had some extenuating circumstances. I know sometimes people have been unwell and missed school, or there have been some major life event that's got in the way, and that can be useful to flag up if it's had a big effect on some of your results. But most of the time, we want to just focus on the positive things, and that's just how applications work. That's what everyone's going to be doing, so there's no dishonesty in that. Everyone expects you in an application to put your best foot forward, to try to demonstrate why you're good for that course, and you're perfectly entitled to admit anything that is going to go against you there. I'm not talking about actively lying, by the way. I mean, I've had very rare examples of one or two students who have come to me with personal statements at school, and it said something like, oh, I've got grade 8 violin, and I sort of said to them, hang on, I didn't know you played the violin, and they said, oh, no, I haven't actually, or I've only got grade 6 violin, but I think I'll have grade 8 by the time I get there. And those sort of things really should not apply, right? That's incredibly dishonest, almost, fraudulent even, and can get you in a lot of trouble, right? So I'm not talking about exaggerating the truth. I'm not talking about putting in anything that is false. You also should not include anything that is just something that you hope you will have, unless you actually state that. You can say I'm working towards grade 8 violin, that's fine, but you should never say that you've got it just because you think you're going to get it. But do focus on positives, right? And take out any hint of negativity that might be in the statement, right? Even if it's something like, I didn't think I wanted to apply for this course a year ago, but now I do, right? That for me is a bit negative. Okay, you can instead talk about the moment at which you realised you wanted to study the course, right? Okay, it's saying the same thing, but the tone is different and it will come across differently. There should never be a paragraph that's half of the whole personal statement or anything like that. If there is, you need to do some editing. Actually, editing is also really important. Every personal statement I've ever received on a first draft, I've been able, when I've tried, to just cut the length in half, right? And to keep all of the relevant information. Again, we're trying to say things precisely, okay? In this video, I can get away with really long sentences. I can talk a bit fast. I'm going to repeat myself a bit. That's how conversational language works. But formal written language, you can really do well at editing and rearranging sentences in ways that make them efficient and effective. And if you're struggling for space on a personal statement, probably, unless you've got some absolutely enormous range of achievements that you're trying to get into the statement, probably you've just written it in too long a way, right? I've never known any student, even some of the most impressive students that I've taught, and I've taught some very, very impressive students, even the most impressive, once we've had a bit of a redraft of their application, we've been able to say everything clearly and succinctly and get it all in, right? So cut out some of that stuff where you've talked too much about the subject rather than talking about yourself. Cut out the repetition, cut out the unnecessary things, and you will get everything in very, very easily indeed, I promise you. One thing I'd say as well is that the advice here might be slightly different if you're applying as a mature student or perhaps as an international student. You might want to put a little bit more into your application about why you're coming to the subject when you are, or why you're choosing to study in the UK rather than somewhere else. And you might just make a bit more space in the application for that, because I think the universities will be interested to hear about that. Fundamentally, the application procedure shouldn't be too different. I mean, I applied for my PhD here at Bath a few years ago as a mature student, having done some other things, and my application probably did look a bit different to people coming straight out of an undergraduate degree. But fundamentally, I was trying to prove the same things as they were, that I was suitable to do a research degree, and that I was enthusiastic about it, and that I was, coming for the right reasons. So do think about that. Similarly, if you've taken a gap year, or if you're applying a year later, you might just want to mention something about that, but I wouldn't go on excessively about it. Taking a gap year is quite an ordinary thing to do. In maths in particular, people can be a little bit worried that after a gap year, you may have forgotten a few things, and you might, it is a subject that, you can get out of the habit of pretty quickly. So you might just want to explain how during that gap year you have kept going with a little bit of math. Again, a gap year or even a reapplication, sometimes people apply a second time. You don't have to make too much out of it, really, to be honest. I mean, if you're applying at roughly the time you'd be expected to, the universities aren't going to necessarily flag that up too much if you're a well-qualified candidate. But, if you've had, say, a 10-year gap or a 30-year gap or something, and you're coming back to study, then they'll probably be a bit more interested in what you've done. And I would say, applying as a mature student, there are a lot of although there are some disadvantages in terms of not having come immediately out of A-levels, usually the life experience and the ways of managing your studies and all this sort of thing more than make up for that, and mature students can be, applications can be looked upon very favourably. So don't assume that just because you're not in the typical position to apply for a course that you're going to be disadvantaged. One other thing that's worth thinking about is the timing of preparing to write your personal statement and how you're going to get feedback on it. So I've given you quite a bit of advice here, and I would often go through this advice with students, and when I say this advice to them, they sort of get the idea, and they can't necessarily always put it into practice, and then take some actually going through, maybe I cross out a few statements, give some examples, and send it back to them. Now, that process takes time, and it also requires some expertise from someone else. Now, we don't all have access to a huge amount of time from experienced teachers, but do find teachers in your school who might be willing to help. Be conscious of their time, so make sure you go to them having done some work already, and if you've shown that you've put some effort into it, they're much more likely to give you additional time. Okay, so obviously working in the schools that I did, I also spent a lot of time with students who hadn't done very much work on their personal statements, and part of my job was to sort of encourage them to get on with that process and to get on with it at an early stage. But the students that really got the most out of it were the ones who came with quite well-formed personal statements, kind of knew what they wanted to write, wanted some help with the structure, wanted some rewriting. If you're going to someone at a too early stage, you can end up having to spend a lot of time on some quite basic things. So, watch this video, think about what I've said, try and write a first draft, and then take it to someone. The person you take it to doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher, by the way. I would say ideal people to ask for advice can be teachers, but can also just be, a family friend that you know. Ideally, it would be, an adult who's in a job, who's, used to some amount of writing or dealing with emails and writing formally. Now we don't all know lawyers and professional people like that. I certainly didn't when I was a child myself, but I knew people who had professional jobs and were able to help with that. Your family even can help you with the proofreading, even if they're not experts in the subject they're applying to. Your close family can still be helpful in proofreading an application, making some suggestions to you. You don't have to take their suggestions, by the way, as well. It's your personal statement, but getting lots of different advice and lots of different opinions on a statement is very useful. Do be a little bit wary about putting your personal statement on online forums, though, and asking for advice there, because one thing I would say is that UCAS do use plagiarism detection software, and it's possible that if you put something online, somebody else might use it, even without your permission, or that somehow the plagiarism software might spot it online and then say that you've plagiarized, even though you've plagiarized yourself. So do watch out for that. Much better to not put your personal statement in any visible form in that way. That's one of the reasons, actually, in the end, where I decided not to include any of the personal statements that I was sent. Thank you, by the way, to everyone who did send me your personal statements to have a look at. They've been really great for me to just remember the sort of things that people put in personal statements and to make this advice video. And I've sent everyone individual feedback on their personal statements if they sent me something. So I hope that was useful to you. But in the end, I didn't want to put your statements even remotely close to the internet, just in case someone else took something from the video and decided to use it themselves. So I hope that was useful. As I said, I learnt about how to write personal statements from writing my own applications, but also from 7 years working in 2 of the country's top private schools, sending students to good universities year in, year out. And it's really frustrating to me that this advice isn't more widely and well available. So I really hope this is useful. I really hope this gets out there. And so I'd love it if you watch this video, but also shared it with your friends, like the video and subscribe to the channel. But also post this video on Facebook or on Twitter or Instagram or wherever else you're active, sharing this advice with as many people as possible. If you have found it useful, do consider supporting me on Patreon as well. The more supporters I can get there, the more likely it is I'm going to be able to spend more of my future making content like this. If you don't want to do that, there are free ways you can support me by going over to the Mathsaurus website and signing up for a free trial of Audible or Amazon Prime, or when you come to buy maths books, think about looking at the ones on my website that I've suggested and clicking through those. I've put some of my favourite books about maths and just related to maths, and ones that are great for preparing to university maths courses over there. And I think there's some great recommendations there. Please put in the comments, by the way, if you've got any others that you have found useful. Perhaps you're watching this as a graduate or as a current student and there's something you think I've missed. I'd love to hear about that. I'd love to hear about your ideas about personal statements as well. I mean, I've given you a template here that I think is good advice, but there are other ways of doing it. And, I'm not saying you have to be absolutely prescriptive about this to write a good personal statement. I think it's just a good structure that gives you a professional personal statement that you can then also tweak a little bit depending what subject you're applying to, depending what you want to get into your application. So I hope this was useful. Really good luck with your applications, good luck with your personal statements. I'm sorry I don't have time to give you all individual feedback on them, but do feel free to put in the comments if you've got any particular questions, and perhaps at some point I'll make a follow-up video as well.